Hey guys, Stuart here, and I just thought I'm going to be sharing Kenneth's strategies from a modeling standpoint. So, what I want to let you know is that this is the first cut, all right? Well, not really the first cut, this is the second cut. The first cut was way too messy, as you can see in my board here. Too much stuff, too many different models of the way Kenneth thinks, but I'm going to at least narrow it down to one main piece, which is the 10 contrast strategies. Okay, I think for many of you, you're probably wondering like, what? There are 10 contrast strategies? Yep, there are 10. And while Kenneth tends to use a few of them more so than the others, allow me to explain from the modeling standpoint what this looks like. So first and foremost, I want to make sure that you recognize what it means to do modeling. Modeling basically looks at a group of people, not just one person, a group of people. The good news is that Kenneth has a lot of mentors and he's kind of like crystallized a lot of his thinking quite quickly, right? Quite well. So it's almost like if you go to that source, you have, a 3-in-1 kind of a package or 4-in-1 kind of package. So that's very, very good. The disadvantage is that if you just learn from the surface, you're just going to get, whatever you put in from it. From modeling, so just allow me to explain NLP for a little while. Neurolinguistic programming was built upon the science of modeling. When I observe someone and I go, how does he do it inside? Then I have a reliable strategy for accomplishing something that somebody else has done. So that's why I'm constantly hunting for excellence. I'm constantly looking for ways by which people actually build out a core set of strategies or achieve certain types of results. Okay. Now, having said that, the reason why you want 5 or 6 people, maybe even up to a dozen, is because in a certain field, there must be different people with different strategies. Otherwise, just like investing has come to a point where there's nothing unique about it anymore. You just learn a bunch of strategies, and then it's pretty much the same old, right? If you take a look at, for example, in the past, internet marketing came to a level of maturity where everybody knew you had to set up a opt-in page and then a thank you page. But now things have evolved because of technology. So once technology begins to evolve, you're going to see development of new strategies. So don't get me wrong, this is not the holistic understanding of copywriting. Because copywriting, if you break it down, you've got things like headlining, bullet points, colors, structure, videos, even things like the way you're structuring buttons, right? FAQs. Do you even use FAQs? Your headers, your footers, your scripts, your Facebook pixels, your Google pixel, right? All of these are elements that you need to track. I mean, where do you host it on? Is it going to be detrimental to your SEO? There's a whole range of these different things which I'm not going to talk about in landing page strategy, all right? Over here, I am going to focus primarily on the viewpoint of Kenneth and Kenneth Yu's approach to thinking, right? I think those are fundamental. Let me give you an example. Just because a kid is bad at mathematics doesn't mean he's bad at mathematics, okay? You got to get this right. It means his cognitive strategies are wrong. And the reason why this is the case is because for most kids who hate mathematics is because they were not put into the right states. They were not able to be conscientious because they had no basis for conscientiousness in the first place, which is a psychological trait. And that's why they end up hating it. It's not because they intrinsically hate it. It's because there wasn't any reason to hate it in the first place. The wrong neurons were firing at the wrong time. So it's almost like, all right, so let's say you love pasta, but you don't like bread. But you don't understand the difference because both of them are supposed to be wheat. And your mom is telling you, you gotta eat wheat, right? And you go like, Mom, I hate this bread thing, right? I want pasta. But mom says, no, it's the same thing. Just eat your bread. And the more that happens, the more of this resistance builds up. And of course, you're going to hate your subject, you're going to hate your mom, not because of cause and effect, but because of correlation. And that's the problem with a lot of human behavior. You are correlationally disliking something without really looking at its root cause and the way to shift that. Okay, so if you had a way to strengthen a child's cognitive strategies, surely you'll do that. But problem is most people don't know how to do so. Instead, they send their kids for tuition. And tuition is going to mess up everything because you're teaching content without the underlying mechanism. It's like having a car trying to drive down an expressway at 110 kilometers an hour by just telling the driver how to step on the accelerator when there is no engine, right? That's dumb. Anyway, in any case, I want you to understand that if you build up your cognitive strategies and the toolbox of strategies in the foundational ways that Kenneth thinks, all right, then you're in the money. You're in the money because now you don't have to rely on a template. You can rely on ways of articulating, ways of conversing, and it's likely to spill over not just into your writing, but also in your communication overall. All right. So I'm just going to dive into how he gets started. Ultimately, he gets started with something called state dissonance. I realized that one of his strategies is creating a very clear distinction between state dissonance and state coherence. Right. Coherence is when the internal representational system is when we say resonance, it means that you and I, we share the same representational system. Okay? So if I am saying dragon portfolio, the dragon portfolio, the moment I say that, you are resonating from an auditory standpoint because I'm utilizing the auditory in order to create that resonance inside of you. Right? So you tend to say something to yourself in response to what I say. So again, going back to a little bit of NLP background, there is something known as a representational system. A representational system is basically a sensory system where words and internal representations collide. So we have the visual, auditory, kinesthetic, digital representational systems. So in brief, visual is what you see, right? Auditory is what you hear, kinesthetic is what you feel, sense, or experience. And also smell and taste. Okay, because we tend to lump the olfactory and the gustatory underneath the kinesthetic dimension. And then there's the digital, which is more process. I'm going to go digital because utilizing the digital approach to breaking things down helps me to see what the context of the model is. So rather than teach you something that's a little bit out of your reach, which is how exactly I do it, that's a master practitioner strategy. That explains how I can digest information, not just at one layer. When I look at people like Anthony Robbins, I don't just attend a $1,000 course or $5,000 course. I'm taking that apart so that I reap 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 times more than whatever it is other people are getting, because people are just scratching the surface. It's silly, right? It's a waste of money. It's a waste of time. So by going into this definition of NLP, you begin to realize that we go into what we call TOTES, or the smallest behavioral unit. When somebody says, I sleep, I go for the TOTE. The TOTE is a specification of exactly how you sleep. Nobody tells you that, but in NLP, we're trained to be able to dive into that. Unfortunately, most NLP practitioners and most NLP master practitioners don't take this skill seriously. They're just interested in, motivation, inspiration, all that kind of stuff. That's not it, okay? If you want to become motivating, then you better get down to the TOTES of motivation. You want to become inspiring and good at sales, you better get down to the details of the TOTE, which stands for the trigger, operation, test, and exit. It's something developed by Miller, Galante, and Pribram way back in 1960s when they started to explore general semantics. I won't go into those details, but you can read about it. So let's talk a little bit about state dissonance. Remember, Kenneth talked about getting into the state by listening to harsh music. Now, what that does to the brain is obvious, right? So there are vibrations, there are vibrational patterns in music. So when you play something like, whatever it is that he says, I can't remember exactly what he said, but it's a rock band, right? So he gets into this kind of cadence inside his brain, and this cadence tends to create for him a completely different brainwave state. It's getting into the zone. If you want to read more about the zone, read up Professor Mihai Csikszentmihalyi in the book called Flow. Right? Basically, it's a dimensional axis where if you are not challenged, right, and you don't have very much skill, then basically you're bored. But if you want to move from boredom into flow, you need to increase the capabilities or the competence that you have, but also increase the challenges that you face. And that's what it's all about, is pushing the limits, pushing the envelope. And when things are harsh, when there's so-called conflict, that's the state that you can go into. All right. So in a state dissonance, what does that do? My guess is it activates the contrast strategy inside his head. So I noticed that a lot of good writers tend to do that. They read an article and they go, what kind of stupid 10 tips are these? They're just generalizations. And then they get so fired up, they go in and they tear that article down. And that's one of the ways by which I managed to get Secrets of Internet Millionaires up in 2007. Anyway, let's take a look at the 10 contrast strategies. I'll give you the overview. I'll explain part of the tote. And then we'll dive into the evidence. Number 1, layering. Number 2, incongruity. Number 3, contextual contrast. Number 4, analogical contrast. Number 5, positional contrast. Number 6, objectification. Number 7, sensory contrast. Number 8, expectation contrast. Number 9, aspirational contrast. And number 10, temporal narrative contrast. I'll explain what they are bit by bit. So let's start off with temporal narrative contrast. This strategy is used when there is a story being told, and basically you are accessing your recall of what was going on inside your mind. So, for example, you start talking, once upon a time, there was a big bad wolf. Okay, so this triggers off the thought, because it goes back in time into the narrative that you're familiar with, all right? But all of a sudden, you say, and this big bad wolf was naked. Okay, so all of a sudden, the contrast created breaks your expectation. In neurolinguistic programming, we call this a pattern interrupt, but in copywriting, this is as valuable a contrast as it can. Now, what this does is it changes your state. At the end of the day, most contrasts will create either a positive or a negative state change, or it causes a stacking state change, and we'll talk about that in a while. So Kenneth used this about 3 times, probably more, but these are the 3 that are the most obvious. He talks about reality versus imagination in terms of his younger days. He talks about being in a battle, and then the white knight comes out, and then it's like, oh, you guys are all at peace. Okay, fine. And he talks about how a funny situation where his customer had already got a product, but they still wanted to buy it anyway. We all know the narrative, but in terms of the behind the scenes view, it looks very funny. Now, one of the things about contrast is that it can create humor, but I don't have that much bandwidth right now to create both a contrast strategy as well as a humor strategy. Just understand that contrast is one of the keys to understanding humor. All right. So this is a very powerful strategy, but if used correctly in the right context, you will be able to do it. So, for example, if you can get inside the mind of the customer or the client or the person reading your copy, you're telling them something, right? So they're hearing what you're saying, and they're expecting something inside their mind. And then you pivot to a completely different description. Once upon a time, there was a king who wielded a very powerful sword that he pulled out of a rock. Now, that is reference, correct? And all of a sudden, this sword melted in his hands. Okay, wow. Okay, suddenly there's this contrast, and all of a sudden, you got the buyer's attention. Okay? Let's look at aspirational contrast. This has got to do with Kenneth's way of thinking about the future, thinking about goals and directions. So what he does is this. He creates either a visual image of what's the future, and possibly the way he talks to himself, and then he contrasts this to whatever is happening in currently, what he hears and what he sees inside the head. So in a sense, the contrast is, okay, what's happening now versus what I see of the future? Are they congruent? Okay. And the K here is nondescript because it could be negative, in which case then I better pull up my socks. If it's positive, good, I'm on the right track. So he talks about this many times. So it's very obvious that he utilizes this strategy for visioning, visualization, and all right, I just wanted to add a bit of a correction because I realized that when I went to expectation versus aspirational contrast, I thought that they were the same. But I think in reality, what I did was I just duplicated this and I forgot to change it. So let's take a look at the strategy for aspirational contrast. Aspirational contrast would be, I have an aspiration, but this is what's happening right now. So it follows that my visual construct or my auditory construct, right? The voice that I'm creating inside my head about what goals I have, has to be compared with what I'm hearing today, what I'm seeing today, right? The visual external and the visual auditory external, that leads to either a positive or a negative emotional state. Whereas expectation contrast is, I already have this train of thought, but then you broke my expectation, and as a result, I have a different emotional state. So I think this follows a little bit more strongly, but if you got further comments, just let me know. Okay, so just wanted to add this addendum so that you can make a clearer distinction for yourselves. You should as well. Okay, so outrage and ridicule versus systemic change. He talked about that. The idea of the reality of God manifesting in me. Remember the sort of like a mini prayer that he was saying? If you are real God, make all that is good in me so that it is an amplification of the fact that you are real. Okay, so this is a very powerful entry point. Failure versus planning. He says, plan to the point of your inability to fail. He talks about, if you're thinking, you're not really procrastinating, you're not really waiting to not make a mistake. Okay, he says, get good in your offers, otherwise whatever you sell is just a commodity. All right. Free training that has already made people money. This is a great line. It's like, guys, if my free training has made a lot of money, the implication is that if you proceed further on, what happens if there's paid training, right? So if I get paid training, I'm going to make even more money, which generally is true for people who are worth their salt, like Kenneth. Okay. Warm versus cold buyer data. This is very interesting because you're looking at an aspirational goal of, I want to get more buyers, but I've got warm and then I have cold buyers. And then if I go for warm buyers, they're just gonna give me platitudes, whereas cold buyers are going to give me the truth. And that, in my opinion, is quite a contrast, right? The way of thinking itself is a contrast. People using Holy Grail copywriting to churn out offers for their team, helping their team, and so on. Again, I don't have Holy Grail copywriting. What does this do to me? It forces me to have to think about the offers that I could churn out. And in a sense, it is also a form of positional contrast, right? Just remember, a contrast effect in one of these categories could also create a contrast stacking effect on another category. And my suspicion is, if you can create a contrast statement that covers all 10 categories, that will be a very, very powerful statement to make, okay? You're only as good as your last blockbuster, which, is here's my last blockbuster, okay, and here's my future. Does it make me feel that what I'm achieving right now is matching up with whatever it is that I want to do? So if I've got a blockbuster, but I haven't, it's out of date, for example. So now I'm going to get a negative feeling that, I'm not good enough, or I need to find another blockbuster, and so on and so forth, right? So, and that goes back to the idea of arrogance, the historic excellence versus the future. This is classic. So, inside of your mind, if you're talking about your current successes, right, but your future is incongruent, right, with the past successes, then you're not going to get anywhere. Okay, and he uses this as a very powerful explanation. Is the life and the business goal that I have sufficient to get me to where I want to go? Okay, so this sums up the aspirational contrast. Let's look at expectation contrast. So expectation contrast is quite fun because what you're doing is you're toying around with your customers' expectations almost literally, right? So what's an expectation? An expectation is I am imagining something of the future. Right? It's similar to the aspiration, but the aspirational contrast gets you to look at a goal, okay, and what you say to yourself when you get to that goal, whereas the contrast relies primarily on what you know of the past. Okay, so I already expect a train of thought to happen, and I'm saying something to myself, this is going to happen, but actually what happens now is completely different, and it swings me in a completely different direction. So all of a sudden, I am given an internal visual experience based on what is being said on the outside. The coding looks similar to the aspirational content, but the content contrast, but the content is slightly different. So in terms of aspirational contrast, we're looking at output versus input, right? So he says, surely I need to have more input in order to have more output. So that's why he talks about his reading. I won a merit prize by not training, right? I was writing a promotion during accounting class. So the presence of this breaks your expectation. Sorry, let me move that. Breaks your expectation of what an accounting class should be. And in fact, it gives you the sense, by implication, he was quite rebellious. World-class copywriter without writing a single word. Again, okay, I know he's going to talk about copywriting, but then without a single word, how did that happen? A bright, shiny object syndrome, chasing after bright, shiny objects is natural. I hear loud, excessive music. Faith is merely security. Billionaires versus sound family. So a lot of people would say that, if you're rich, it's very difficult for you to have a stable family. But he says, contrary to the fact, his circle is filled with people who have sound families who are billionaires. And I agree with that. Maybe it is a common misunderstanding that you have to sacrifice, right? And as a result, the expectation is broken. And he says this, if you get your offer right, then you don't have to rely on funnels and copy, which is both ironic at the same time mystifying, because how do you do that? Okay, use free training and make money. I already mentioned this earlier on in the aspirational contrast. Religion is the most persuasive structure on earth. Interesting, because now I had an expectation that maybe the most effective persuasion structure was something else, but then now you're saying, oh, it's religion? Okay, now I'm interested to explore it. A weak offer is something that you give to someone who doesn't want it. Okay, so again, I expected a weak offer to be something else, but then you told me, okay, it's just the person whom I'm offering it to. Okay, Netflix story and conflict. Never in your entire life would you have thought that Netflix story and conflict is the core of understanding contrast, isn't it? Because people have invested time in the script. So obviously Netflix is a worthwhile investment now. So instead of thinking of it as entertainment, think of it as a $10 training every month. Okay, I would change arrogance that I know better. Again, this is also positional contrast, because it forces you to change position. Am I arrogant? Do I know better? And by changing arrogance, it's like maybe it's not surprising to many people, but the expectation is like, what would you change in your business? It's like, oh, I'll change my business model, I'll change my way of innovation. But no, it wasn't an external thing. It's an internal thing, right? Which is very powerful. Deriving enjoyment from accounting, which is ironic because he hates accounting, and yet he flips the expectation because it forces you to think about something that you hate, but you can still derive joy from. Fascinating, right? Okay, so no savings he's talking about the market crash in the future. People don't have savings, companies don't have savings, so it's going to be an opportunity because you're going to get bargains. How does that happen? Well, if you've ever heard of a fire sale, it makes perfect sense. When people have had a fire, right, and they need to restart, right, the house has burned down, they need to sell stuff very quickly in order to make money. So this is basically what it is. It's a adjustment or attunement of your expectation. All right. So you'll notice that he uses expectation contrast a lot. So now you understand the phrase, you need to give people what they want in a way they do not expect. So there you go. Whole range of them in the 2-hour interview. Okay. Sensory contrast, dragon versus volatility. What the sensory contrast does is this. It creates for you like a first visual image and a second visual image, and then it creates, because it's side-by-side comparison, you go like, oh, this one is good, one of the other visual images is good. Or you can take two images and then you go like, oh, this choice is going to be bad. So when there's a sensory contrast, it cannot be a contrast and an effective contrast if it doesn't create an emotional state change. So it could be visual or an auditory contrast, and it leads to some kind of change in state. So dragon So auditory versus volatility, right? Drop of blood, visual. Massacre, right? Man, boy. Well, man and boy are two contrasting images in the first place, but the fact that he used man, boy creates a little bit of humor, right? Eat sharks for breakfast. Wow. Visual image large versus your average breakfast. Look out for something that people are, that not a lot of people are doing. This is a little bit of a hypnotic trance because it's like, I need to look for what you cannot see. It's ironic, but V1, V2. Okay, so that's sensory contrast. Objectification, or what a lot of neuro-linguistic programmers know as nominalization. So what you do is a verb or a process is converted into a noun or an abstraction, right? So objectification itself is an objectification. In fact, it's a double nominalization, from a sense that if you understand NLP, an object is a noun, right? Because it can carry an article, a noun, an object, the object, right? So it can carry an article. So when he says objectification, it turns the object into a much more abstract thing. It's like enthusiasmation, right? So if there's such a thing. Anyway, so he goes into things like Christ consciousness, which is part of his aspirational strategy. Gravitational causes. You probably never heard of this before, but it's like a gravitational cause. Now, what this does is it adds a modifier to the noun. And again, as I'm speaking, I'm sometimes breaking my own definition, because when you think about it a little bit deeper, it becomes more clear, right? So trust me, to have to go through 2 hours of fine-tooth combing is not an easy task, okay? So gravitational causes is not a verb or process turned abstract. It is already a noun that is further embellished through the use of a fascinating or an unexpected adjective, right? So you modify the noun by adding a unique adjective. So instead of saying the awesome sidekick, how about the invisible champion, right? Awesome sidekick sounds like bleh, right? But invisible champion is like, yeah, I'm a sidekick. I'm not really seen, but okay, if you get the idea. A scalable parable, not only utilizing of rhyme, which generates the sensory contrast, right? Scalable parable is rhyming, but also parable has never been used in the context of being scalable before. So he's actually also utilizing what we call layering. So parable is religious or folklore, right? Cultural. Scalable is business. When you take folklore and business and you combine them, wow, okay, I can see how that works. Blockbuster formula, right? So we've always heard of blockbusters, but can it become a formula? Oh my goodness. Okay, so it's like taking two things, adding them in order to stack them. So it's very powerful. So think of objectification in this way, and I think you'll get to a point where you can also come up with your own objectification. Right? Positional contrast. So perceptual positions in NLP are what we call, we have three perceptual positions: first, second, and third positions. So the first position means I'm looking out through my own eyes. Second means I'm looking from another person's viewpoint. And third is the observer's viewpoint. Okay. Not surprisingly, in a modeling deconstruction, what I'm doing is I am in meta view. I'm traversing all three by observing it from a different vantage point. Okay, so it goes that the position, whichever position I am, contrasted with another position, gets me to think differently, right? And therefore, I shift my emotional state. Okay, so look at this. I thrust yourself in conflict to earn the right to talk to those in conflict. See? So you're in one position, you're thrust into this area, you think differently. Okay, it's powerful. Mechanics versus empathy. Right? So on one hand, you're diligently doing this, but you don't step into another person's shoes. So this is empty, and therefore you don't resonate with people. Beautiful. Be a monopoly, be unregulated. So what he is doing is he's getting you to stop being you, but rather being a monopoly, right? Agnostic versus Christian. This was his so-called mini debate with his uncle. Same thing. So he shifts the perspective. It's no longer about whether you believe in or not Christianity, and he said that quite clearly. Tethered versus untethered. So we were talking a little bit about being unbalanced and when you lose a tether, and he said that you tether so that you get perspective, right? If you need a strong family, you tether to people who have strong families, and then you get to think like them. Okay, 99% of whatever business do not survive. Okay, so for the optimist, right, he's splashing some dose of reality on you so that you think differently, right? Value-based versus floating, he's talking about his wife as a tether. So in a sense, sometimes you and I need to look at partners, whether business or life partners otherwise, who think differently, and therefore they can give us this positional contrast in order to make a more enriched decision. You give people what they want in a way they don't expect. Okay, that's also positional contrast. All right, let's go to analogical contrast. And this is one of his favorites, as you can tell, right? So what he does is whatever analogy he's giving, he's contrasting it with another analogy, and therefore it makes you imagine possibilities, right? Either possibilities that get you to feel bad about it or feel good about it. Navigate your prospect's mind with landmarks. Again, navigation inside the mind is the mind is psychological. Navigation is a physical thing. So you're contrasting these two analogies, right? Chaos is a ladder. Of course, this was taken from Game of Thrones, but you get the idea. Life is war, life is a battle, life is a marathon. Okay, so again, using three different analogies: war, war, and life. Right? Well, actually, marathon now is seen as a sport, but war and sports is also a contrast in terms of analogy. Even though marathon was coined as a result of a battle, right? So the Battle of Marathon. I don't know whether Kenneth knows this, but it's interesting to note the historical context. Conflict versus peace. So he talks about the white knight analogy. Remember? So conflict versus peace. He gives examples of how you can be bored and experience chaos. It's because you have boredom, and that's why when contrasted against chaos, things look fresher. All right. This is funny because if you guys play games, I don't, but Red Dead Redemption is a gruesome game. You can go Google it. Super Mario is just like this, family environment kind of thing, right? So very, very big contrast in terms of analogy, but he uses it to great effect. Okay, the Hippocrates medicine and analogy was just funny as well. It was, if you want to learn copywriting, don't learn from just the dead people, right? Learn from people who are alive who have advanced the copy. Don't learn from, if you want to advance medicine, don't just stop at Hippocrates. Red ocean and blue ocean, this again is a visual contrast, but if you understand the reference, then it comes from obviously the guys who wrote the book Blue Ocean Strategy, right? But blue ocean and red ocean tie into his further analogy of the shark, right? The bigger shark. And then this very funny reference when you think of a duck and a shark. He said sitting ducks versus a bigger shark, right? When you take a look at those two, which one looks fiercer, right? It's only through that analogical contrast that you can see that being the shark makes sense. The 1% of a failure of a bridge. And he said this, failing forward seems okay, but if just 1% of a failure of a bridge can lead to catastrophic results. So you see, the moment you create an analogy, and then you contrast the analogy between the current way you're thinking and the way that you can think outside of that context, all of a sudden it becomes pertinent or salient in your mind. Now, I know for some of you, you're going to think, hang on, but failure of a bridge is different because in a bridge, you engineer it and you can reach 99.99% success rate, right? You may have cracks, but those are things that can be dealt with. Whereas, in terms of copywriting, it's not really an engineering thing. You could probably fail 70% and still succeed. let's not get into those kinds of details. The ideas are more important than to get down to those kinds of nitty-gritties. Okay, so I hope you understand. Durian in context. To the average Asian, durian is lovely. It's a treat. It's like a luxurious fruit. It's of great nutritional value too, by the way. But in the context of a German postal service, no, it is not. Okay. Likewise, theme park offer during COVID is a bad idea compared with making a good offer at any other time. So you can have fitting time, but not temporally. I love this one. Stale bread versus pecan pie. It elicits something completely different. It's not visual anymore, but it is gustatory, right? It's almost like steak versus grass, something like that, right? That may be a much broader, a much bigger divide, right? But the idea is you have to divide anyway. My gift is only 2 cogs in a machinery. So he was talking about his mistaken understanding that just because I'm good at copywriting, I can start a business. Okay, optimizing a car for a moon trip. That's just funny. I mean, it brings back memories of the impossible, which is like Back to the Future, right? But even then, that guy didn't go to the moon. So he's saying the vehicles are very important. You need a rocket ship to go to the moon. Now, although that sounds trite, when we deconstruct it, I think Albert Einstein used that as well. If you try and judge the capability of a fish by its ability to climb a tree, you're basically, causing a lot of problems for yourself, right? So this is, again, an analogy, and very, very powerful as well. Let's look at context and contextual contrast. So the context is this. There is a context, right? Visual, auditory, kinesthetic experience, number 1 versus number 2. And when you contrast these, again, it gives you a different feeling. Now, the context means the physical, environmental context, or even the time context, right? So, for example, in the good old days, they used to think that writing headlines that were very stunning, were very shocking, would grab people's attention. But there was someone who said, no headline required, which was a really bold statement to make at that point of time. So it's like, what? Really? And true enough, as they read through, every single testimonial beneath that line was proof that there was no headline required. And that created a lot of credibility, right? If I'm not mistaken, that was called Traffic Secrets by John Rees. Very, very powerful back in those days. Anyway, so he talked about his studies were boring, but his books were, helping him to create a little kingdom inside. His English was good. His other languages were like, different contexts. So he's creating a divide and establishing a divide in the plot line. Party town versus one escalator. The moment you see this context, it's interesting. Security versus chaos. Security comes from his description of religion, but chaos comes from like everything else outside, right? So if you understand the chaos, security helps you to handle chaos a lot better, which is interesting. All right, and of course, contextual contrast is not as strongly brought out here, but I can imagine how it is used very powerfully in a sales copy, right? Incongruity. Oh, this one is, in my view, I think this is one of the most powerful ones, right? But because we're not talking about any specific target audience in mind, so incongruity doesn't really come up. So he established incongruence with Malaysian teachers, right? So, of course, there are some, there are teachers and then there are teachers. So what he does is he gets the context and compared with contextual contrast, where the kinesthetic experience is just difference. It could be neutral or it could be positive. Incongruence is a negative kinesthetic impact. So he's going like, look, you can't even pronounce the word crocodile. I might as well teach your class, right? And there's this hint of arrogance, sarcasm, inside that. Sometimes I write for myself rather than the client, and it usually doesn't sell, right? So he mentioned that incongruence, and that state is negatively applied to himself, which is humor, self-deprecating humor. Mistake mechanics for mastery. Again, oh, I'm so smart, I know the blueprint. but that's not mastery. Okay, you get a good result versus maybe you're just lucky. Okay, Hippocrates, again, this is repeated, so I won't go through that again. It has dual function. They don't have savings even beyond a month. Okay, wow. Companies do this. That's so incongruent. That's negative, right? It strikes this fear in people, actually. Okay, and of course he does layering by combining two genres, one on top of the other. So Game of Thrones plus investing, right? Netflix and copywriting. Okay, Frankenstein them together. So Frankenstein is a reference to a fictional storyline of the guy who was put together and then brought to life. But in a very cold and morbid sense, that's exactly what we're doing in triangulating things, right? Marrying different things together and then turning it into something completely different. So while it is apt, it also creates this feeling like, wow, different feeling, right? So it's no longer just Frankenstein as a story. No longer is it just branding as emerging trends plus values plus expertise in order to brand an expert, right? It's like Frankensteining all those things together. So very powerful. In fact, Frankenstein them together, I referred to it as a frankensteinthem.com as a funny way of objectification. Okay, all right. So guys, you see the 10 strategies of contrast, and you realize that there are different ways of creating contrast. If anything, if copywriting is about creating a contrast that generates a direction, then you should be more attentive to contrast. How do you structure and weave contrast in such a way that makes people to see your point, they see your argument much more clearly? If anything, it is an amplification strategy of what people should be paying attention to. Selling is also like this. What you're doing is you amplify a pain in order for the solution to become very viable. This is what Kenneth talks about in terms of, you want to create the bloodshed, you want to establish chaos. It's not just one drop of blood, but an entire massacre, so that you can contrast. And he actually specifically mentioned the word contrast, but it was so nondescript, I think most people would have missed it out. And when I pulled through the entire transcript with fine-tooth comb, lo and behold, there were 10 different strategies for contrasting. So now, I wonder if you realize how powerful this can be. If you can layer and utilize and weave contrast after contrast after contrast, it creates the end result of people going like, that was a dumb way of thinking previously, or this is a much more appealing way of thinking now, or wow, this is an elevated status. Now, of course, you need to back it up with your own proof, right? So don't just use it and then make claims that you can't back up. But I hope that I've given you some food for thought, and I hope that you will continue to utilize this set of strategies in such a powerful way that you can transform the copywriting industry.